Good morning, everyone. And welcome. It's so great to see you all here. I'm Rosie Hidalgo, and I serve as the director of the Office on Violence Against Women here at the Department of Justice. I'm so humbled. It's truly an honor to be gathered here with all of you in the great hall of the Department of Justice and with all of you who are participating online. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us today. Each one of you has been a crucial part of this remarkable journey of the Violence Against Women Act and advancing our nation's commitment to prevent and to improve our response to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and other interconnected forms of gender-based violence, and ultimately our North Star to end all forms of gender-based violence. Your collective efforts have led to this pivotal moment. And it's an honor to welcome you as we reflect today on our unwavering commitment and dedication to increasing access to justice, to safety, to healing, and to having safe communities free from violence. We have an exciting and full agenda today, and throughout the day we're going to be exploring VAWA's origins, the critical importance of centering survivors, their leadership, their voices, their vision and courage, which is what even created VAWA to begin with. And it has been so instrumental to each reauthorization of VAWA. And we know we have further to go. In the past couple days, as we've gathered and held summits and talked to survivors and advocates, it has been an amazing opportunity to reflect on the progress made, but also take this moment for our charge for the next decade and the next 30 years ahead to go even further together. And we know that that also includes enhancing a federal coordinated community response that we're very committed to. And the CCR, the Coordinated Community Response at the local and state and tribal and federal level, that is the hallmark of VAWA. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so we thank you for the role that each and every one of you play in advancing that vision. None of this would be possible without your hard work and commitment. And so today is about centering the incredible, incredible work and advocacy of survivors, advocates, and partners who have made this progress possible, and those who've come before us as champions in this work. And we also honor those who've lost their lives, whose lives have been taken from them, and the amazing, loving people who love them, who then have become champions and leaders in this work as well, and we honor them. And we are fortunate today to be joined by some very special guests this morning. We have Jen Klein, Director of the Gender Policy Council at the White House, and her tremendous leadership here. And she serves also as assistant to the president, and as we all saw last night, the tremendous moving remarks of the president and the tremendous commitment of the Biden-Harris administration to advancing these goals. So we're just so grateful, Jen, that you could join us this morning. And we're honored to be joined by our Justice Department leadership, the Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General Ben Miser, who will be with us a little bit later today, our Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, and the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland. Attorney General Garland is entrusted with the tremendous responsibility of safeguarding our nation and of protecting and advancing civil rights. And we are deeply grateful for his unwavering support of the Office on Violence Against Women, of integrating this work throughout the Department of Justice, and for all his commitment to this mission and all these initiatives. So thank you so much, Attorney General, and please join me in welcoming him to hear remarks.
Thank you, Rosie, for that generous introduction and for everything that you do with respect to VAWA, the office, and combating violence against women. I am very honored to be able to welcome you to the Justice Department for the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act. Three decades ago, VAWA transformed our national response to domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. Its enactment indicated a paradigm shift, not just in the way we address gender-based violence, but in the way we understand it. I was serving as Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General when VAWA was originally enacted in 1994. In that role, I had an all too clear picture of the way that domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking were often handled in police stations, prosecutors' offices, and courtrooms across the country. As Attorney General Janet Reno later described, many, quote, representatives and participants in the criminal justice system looked at domestic violence cases and said, that's a domestic, and they just turned their back. That was so, even though at the time, as Congress found, 1/3 of women murdered in America, approximately 4,000 per year, were murdered by present or former spouses or partners. The same was true of sexual assault. During the VAWA hearings, survivors and experts testified about the devastating effect of prevailing attitudes that distinguish between a rape by a stranger as compared to a rape by an acquaintance, a date, or a partner, and that frequently put the blame on the victim. Congress found that women reported 100,000 rapes to law enforcement in 1990, more than in any previous year in American history. That figure was estimated to represent only 1/3 of the true number. Another 2/3 of victims declined to report to police. Fewer than half of the reports resulted in arrests. VAWA has helped to change that perception and reality. The act gave the federal government tools to intervene in a sphere that had previously been largely the domain of state and local law enforcement. It created new resources and authority to prevent and prosecute these crimes and to support survivors. In so doing, it sent a message. Gender-based and intimate partner violence is not just a private matter, not just a local matter, but a national crisis, one that our country was no longer willing to tolerate. Today, officers, prosecutors, judges, families, and society at large understand what should have always been clear. Domestic and dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking are violent crimes. They cannot be ignored as somehow distinct or private. Today, we recognize that they are among the most serious crimes that our society faces. We recognize the devastating lifelong effects that gender-based violence can have on both the physical and mental well-being of survivors. We recognize that domestic violence calls are among the most dangerous for first responders and victims alike. We recognize that those who have engaged in sexual or domestic violence are far more likely to harm both current and future partners and children, as well as being a danger to the public at large. We recognize that this danger multiplies when these individuals possess a firearm. And we insist that the federal government has not just a duty, not just a role, but must intervene. To return to the words of Attorney General Reno, who said during VAWA's enactment, we recognize that addressing domestic and sexual violence must be, quote, a linchpin in the attack on violent crime. Today, We have the opportunity to recognize the impact the VAWA has had on our country for the past 30 years. We also recognize what it took to ensure VAWA's passage in 1994 and its reauthorization in 2000, 2005, 2013, and 2022. And we recognize that we would not be here today if not for the survivors who offered their powerful and often heartbreaking testimony to their communities with reporters and in congressional hearings. They made real for lawmakers and the American public the toll that these crimes take on women, men, children, families, and entire communities. We also would not be here without the advocates and experts who work to amplify survivors' stories and experiences and put forward solutions. They underscored the need for stronger protections to hold offenders accountable and the need to increase access to services for victims in the aftermath of these terrible crimes. Many of these advocates and survivors are here today. On behalf of the Justice Department and the American people, thank you. Not yet. I have so much more to say. The progress our country has made in addressing gender-based and intimate partner violence is also the result of the work of professionals who have dedicated their lives to carrying out VAWA's promise over the past 30 years. I want to thank the service providers on the front lines who work every day with survivors to ensure that they continue to have a voice, that they are believed, and that they receive the support they need to heal and rebuild their lives. You are true heroes. I want to thank our criminal justice partners, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and judges. You ensure that perpetrators are held accountable, that the rule of law is upheld, and that survivors are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. And finally, I want to thank my colleagues here at the Department of Justice who work tirelessly behind the scenes to implement VAWA's protections. You develop policies and resources to improve investigations and prosecutions. You administer millions of dollars in grant funds every year to support the protection services that survivors need. You enforce laws and prosecute cases in Indian country and advance efforts to end the crisis of missing or murdered Indigenous persons. You defend federal law protections, including in the Supreme Court's last term, when you successfully defended the ban on firearm possession by individuals subject to civil protection orders. Although my position at DOJ in 1994 gave me a grim view into the treatment of gender-based crimes before VAWA, it also gave me a vantage point to see the shift that followed. In 1995, that meant being there as Janet Reno stood up the original Office on Violence Against Women. Since its creation, OVW has awarded and administered more than $11 billion in grants and other funding. I've had the opportunity to work with Rosie and her incredible OVW team, many of whom have been with the office since its founding. I am in awe of their passion, deep expertise, and commitment. I am moved by the relentless work to reach every person touched by these crimes and to show by example that the Justice Department can be an effective and caring partner in this effort. Thank you, Rose. Today, we take stock of the progress that VAWA has advanced, but we recognize that there is so much more to do. The reality remains that in the United States, more than 1 in 3 women experiences sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner within her lifetime. And tribal and historically marginalized groups are disproportionately affected. That is why it was so essential that Congress reauthorized VAWA in 2022, and it is why the Department of Justice remains committed to using every tool at our disposal to end domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking, and to support survivors. As part of that effort, I announced this week that the department is awarding a total of $690 million in grants, all through programs created under VAWA. Among those are awards of more than $171 million across all 50 states and 6 territories under the Stop Violence Against Women Formula Grants program. This program promotes a coordinated community response among law enforcement, prosecutors, courts, victim services organizations, and other community services to ensure the safety of survivors. We are also awarding nearly $6 million under the Enhancing Investigation and Prosecution of Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, Sexual Assault, and Stalking initiative. These funds will be used to promote effective policing and prosecution strategies. We are also leveraging the FBI, ATF, U.S. Marshals, and U.S. Attorney's offices throughout the country. Today, I designated an initial set of 78 communities across the country, with more to follow, where we will surge department resources to combat firearm violence against intimate partners and children. We will designate special assistant U.S. attorneys to focus on this effort, and Justice Department agents and prosecutors will work hand in hand with community stakeholders to develop strategies and prioritize prosecutions for unlawful possession of a gun by those who have committed domestic violence offenses. The program will build on the innovative initiatives that U.S. attorneys' offices are already leading to target domestic violence in their districts. That includes the Western District of Oklahoma's Operation 922 program, which has charged hundreds of domestic abusers with federal firearms offenses to quickly remove abusers from the home, to protect the victims over whom the abusers exert control, and to safeguard law enforcement responding to domestic calls. Together, we do everything, and we will do everything we can to get firearms out of the hands of those who have engaged in domestic abuse. In concert with our work to protect survivors and promote healing, this will save lives. I know that for many of the people in this room, the success story of the Violence Against Women Act is personal. It reflects remarkable vision, decades of advocacy and hard work, steadfast commitment to survivors, and triumph over personal tragedy. To all of you, thank you. You have changed our world. You have saved lives, and you have improved countless lives. I look forward to our continued work together. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks again. Thank you again, Attorney General Garland. We're so pleased he was able to join us this morning before departing for a very busy schedule today. But as you saw, the unwavering commitment of the Attorney General, not just now as leader of the Department of Justice, but throughout his whole career. And so it's just such an honor to have his remarks with us today to center us, to provide that foundation for the rest of our discussion today. And now it is my great honor to invite our next speaker, Jen Klein. As I mentioned, she serves as Assistant to the President and as the Director of the White House Gender Policy Council, which Jen established and led since the outset of this administration when the Gender Policy Council was created by President Biden by executive order to advance gender equity domestically and globally. And Jen comes with a tremendous career of commitment and work in the field to advance these goals, both domestically and globally, and her leadership has been phenomenal, including I had the great honor and privilege of working with Jen as she led the effort across many federal agencies to develop our first ever U.S. national plan to end gender-based violence. And it's the first ever framework, blueprint for a whole of government approach, but it also reflects all the input and guidance and work of survivors and advocates and people in the justice system and across all systems. It's based on those lessons learned, those guiding principles, that vision. So we are so pleased to have Jen with us today to provide some remarks as well. Please help me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Rosie, for that introduction. And I'm going to laugh at the definition of led because I wanted to start by thanking you for all that you have done and for teaching me so much. I had the privilege, as you just heard, of working with Rosie as she masterfully led our work at the White House, both on the VAWA reauthorization of 2022 and, of course, the development of the first ever national plan to end gender-based violence. And I also want to thank Attorney General Garland and, of course, Deputy Attorney General Monaco for your commitment to these issues and for having me here today. It's an honor to mark the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act alongside all of you, survivors, advocates, experts, government partners, leaders in all ways, and partners in this work. I'll start by saying what this room already knows. VAWA is President Biden's proudest legislative achievement. He first introduced VAWA in 1990 when he was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he has championed it ever since. I can still remember, as a newly minted lawyer and very young staffer in President Clinton's White House, how then Senator Biden made it possible. And I'm looking at so many of the staff who made it possible with him, so thank you. Thanks to his leadership, and as I said, the work of so many who are here, right here with us today, VAWA fundamentally transformed our nation's response to violence against women and girls. And we've been building on this critical legislation together ever since, through 4 reauthorizations, including through the VAWA reauthorization of 2022 during this administration, so that each time we've made the law stronger and more responsive to the needs of all survivors. As we heard from the President yesterday, it matters. Even with the progress we've made, of course, there is still so much to do to prevent and end gender-based violence, which is why this administration has made historic investments in VAWA. The President often says, "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." And the Biden-Harris administration values investing in communities so that we can finally end gender-based violence. Thanks to the President's leadership, we've increased funding for VAWA programs by more than 35% since 2021, securing more than $700 million, the highest ever funding level for VAWA implementation. Of course, the Department of Justice is leading this effort and has distributed record funding to states, territories, tribes, coalitions, law enforcement, and more to fund the programs that we know survivors and our nation need and deserve. There's so much more I could say about VAWA and the law's legacy, and that's the work you're going to get to today. I also want to take a moment to put this in the context of the President's broader legacy as a champion of gender equality and equity. So in addition to his unwavering support and leadership on VAWA, he's taken action to address gender-based violence wherever and whenever it occurs, at home, at work, in the military, in schools, in communities, and even online. As president, he's advanced bipartisan reforms to the military's investigation and prosecution of sexual assault and sexual harassment. He signed into law the VOCA Fix Act, which has provided more than $1.4 billion for the Crime Victims Fund to support local programs and services for victims of crime, including survivors of gender-based violence. The President's American Rescue Plan invested nearly $1 billion for domestic violence and sexual assault services and supports through the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. And he's directed his administration to address online harassment and abuse, including deepfakes and online child sexual exploitation. The President finally, as you heard, directed the White House Gender Policy Council to develop the first ever national plan to end gender-based violence, which, thanks to the incredible work of the leaders in this room, we issued last year to guide the administration's efforts to prevent and address gender-based violence really across the entire federal government, working, again, with all partners, including state, local, tribal governments. These are just some of the examples of the work this administration has done in service of our commitment to preventing and ending gender-based violence. So I'll close by saying that it's a privilege to be here today among so many friends, partners, and colleagues, because this work truly takes all of us. Thank you each for the work you do day in and day out. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Rosie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen, for your remarks, your leadership, and the opportunity to really help us all be able to strengthen our federal coordinated community response. And now it's my great honor and privilege to be able to introduce the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco. As the Department of Justice second-ranking official, she oversees the overall operations of the Department of Justice, and she has dedicated her career to reducing violent crime and increasing access to justice. I could say a lot about her bio, but what I want to focus on today as we commemorate the 30th anniversary of VAWA is that she started her career as a young staffer in the Senate Judiciary Committee for then-Senator Biden and played a pivotal role in reaching out to survivors so that they could get their testimony, in calling shelters and advocates to get their input. So it's just so fortuitous that as we gather here today to mark this pivotal milestone, that we can also just express deep gratitude for her leadership here at the Department of Justice, not just for VAWA 94, but also her critical role with VAWA 22 and supporting and guiding the reauthorization, the expansion, the enhancements of VAWA also through her leadership. And so we at the Office on Violence Against Women are deeply grateful, as I know all in the field are, for your leadership and steadfast commitment to advancing this work. So please help me welcome our Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. It is great to see this great hall full to the brim for this anniversary. Really fantastic. Thank you, Rosie, for that very kind introduction. I am very grateful for your leadership and the critical work that you and your entire team at OVW do every single day to work to eradicate gender-based violence across the country. It's an honor to be with you to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act. And I want to add a special welcome to the many department alumni who are here today. Welcome back. And of course, to the leaders, the advocates, the survivors who were the engine behind VAWA years ago and who continue to push us all forward. Thank you for your service and for being here today. Now, the work of so many here today and so many more beyond this great hall produced the first ever comprehensive law to address violence against women in our nation's history. For so many of you, this anniversary carries particular significance, and I know it does for me as well. I was privileged to play a very small part in the passage of the original Violence Against Women Act 30 years ago, as Rosie said, as a young staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Now, as we all know, President Biden led the charge for VAWA as chairman of that committee. But the drafting of that legislation was not a dry legal exercise, nor was it about making technical fixes to the U.S. Code. No, it was at its core about changing attitudes and righting a fundamental wrong. It was about bringing an epidemic of violence out of the shadows, and yes, by sheer force of will and determination of so many, it was about asking the public and demanding that the Congress confront the woeful failure of our criminal justice system to protect survivors and to hold perpetrators accountable. To shed light on this crisis, to shed light on what was happening, Chairman Biden charged his staff to make the case. And with the advocates and survivors and law enforcement and so many others, that's what we did. Now, as Rosie mentioned, I was just out of college, not even a baby lawyer at the time. To say I was a low-level staffer would be to have given me a promotion. My job was to handle constituent mail and basically to do whatever else the lawyers on staff told me to do. Lucky for me, they put me to work. There was one project in particular that stood out. The idea was to document a week in the life of women in America, exposing the epidemic of violence against women in America, to lay bare the effect on everyday lives, to expose the problem of repeat offenders and the failure of protective orders, to describe this violence's impact on children. Working on that report, working on that committee 3 decades ago, I learned from survivors why we needed the Violence Against Women Act. I read and responded to countless letters, mostly from women, who wrote in heart-wrenching detail about the brutal violence and excruciating pain they were suffering, often at the hands of a spouse or an intimate partner. We talked with rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, emergency rooms, police stations across the country to gather data that showed how our system was failing victims and survivors and failing to hold perpetrators accountable. The statistics at the time painted a very grim picture. 98% of rape survivors never saw their attacker caught, tried, and imprisoned. Fewer than half of people arrested for rape were convicted, and almost half of convicted rapists could expect to serve a year or less in jail. But in September of 1994, that began to change. For the first time, VAWA provided legal protection and resources to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. It empowered federal law enforcement to go after perpetrators who crossed state lines and required state authorities to enforce protection orders from other states, freeing survivors to leave violent situations. It closed a major loophole, codifying what should have always been patently obvious, that there is no such thing as consent to sexual acts between federal officers and those held in their custody. It provided legal relief for battered immigrants and created the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which of course is such a vital resource still today. And for the first time, VAWA provided critical funding to those who touch survivors, from law enforcement to social services, to access programs and tools and training. The landmark law we celebrate today profoundly changed how this country protects survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Now, as this gathering knows very well, none of this happened overnight, far from it. It took years of painstaking, brave work by survivors and advocates across this country, building a nationwide movement to end violence against women and support the rights and dignity of survivors. It was these survivors and advocates who started the domestic violence shelters and rape crisis centers, who lobbied the state legislatures to outlaw marital rape and protect victims against their abusers, who fought against harmful myths and stereotypes, urging law enforcement to take violence against women seriously, who organized for campus safety and accountability for offenders, who formed the victim-centered service organizations that continue to push for needed reforms today. Without them, VAWA would not exist, and we would not be here today. So please join me in thanking those leaders who were not only there in 1994, but in 1984, and 1974, and 1964, and long before that. Since VAWA's enactment, we've increased justice for survivors and accountability for wrongdoers. And today, with the largest funding level ever, VAWA's programs are providing more access to services like transitional housing and legal support for survivors, more resources to help law enforcement respond, and more capacity to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. And today, we're also addressing the next frontier in gender-based violence, the proliferation of deepfake images and videos fueled by artificial intelligence. That's why the department is funding a new National Resource Center on cybercrimes and awarding new local law enforcement grants for the enforcement of cybercrimes to bolster training for law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges. This anniversary recognizes the Violence Against Women Act and all of you who made it happen. And it recognizes that VAWA has been transformative in so many ways, in law, in culture, in attitudes. And it was transformative, too, for me in another way. The experience of working with those lawyers, a bevy of fantastic women lawyers, all working for then Chairman Joe Biden, on the Judiciary Committee, and the experience of working on this legislation 30 years ago inspired me to go to law school, to become a lawyer, and to go into public service. That's because I saw what you could do with the law to help people and to protect victims. I was exposed to my very first mentors and role models. I witnessed their relentless drive, smarts, and dedication to getting this law enacted. They were helping bring about real change that would have an impact on people's lives. These women, some of whom you will hear from in a moment, were instrumental in the passage of VAWA, and they were an example for me. Without them, or that experience 30 years ago, I wouldn't be here today as the Deputy Attorney General. I am grateful to be able to recognize them and thank them from this podium today. Cynthia Hogan, Victoria Nurse, Demetra Lambros, and Kathy Russell. Thank you. Our progress to address gender-based violence hasn't been linear, and it's far from finished. The legacy, though, of the Violence Against Women Act is in the courage and the stories and the voices of the victims and survivors who made the original law possible. And it's in the future work by all of us to shape a safer world for women everywhere. Thank you very much.